So hello and welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to have you here today on this rainy evening. Thank you for joining us today here at Green College and on the live stream. I'm Roseanne Sia. I'm an assistant professor at the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice and co-convener of this year's Sound, Silence, Power thematic series. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, and more broadly, Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish nations. In this series, we have really been having rich conversations on how sound and listening can disrupt violent social structures founded on patriarchal and colonial power relations. As we listen to today's talk, I invite us all to reflect on our own relationship to this land that is stolen land, and the people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Unfortunately, I have to announce that our April event had to be canceled because Jonathan Stern cannot travel to Vancouver this year. So we are very disappointed that we won't welcome Professor Stern, but I am very glad to welcome you here today for our February lecture, which is now the final event of the Sound, Silence, Power thematic series. This is a series that aims to think about historical and contemporary silencing and sounds of violence used to oppress and harm. At the same time, we attune to the ways in which sound and listening may prove a potent source of empowerment, resistance, and care. We are grateful to the Public Humanities Hub, a major sponsor, as well as to our co-host, Green College, for their enthusiastic support of the 2023-2024 thematic series. Today's talk meditates on the ways in which narrative soundscapes become a mechanism for detection of and resistance to misogynist social structures in Mexico and globally. Our speaker, Tamara Mitchell, assistant professor of Hispanic Studies at UBC, works at the intersection of politics and aesthetics and contemporary Latin American narrative fiction. She has peer-reviewed articles in CR, the New Centennial Review, Modern Language Notes, Chasqui, and Revista de Estudios Hispánicos, among other venues, and her first book manuscript, novel Crises, Post-National Fiction in Neoliberal Mexico and Central America, is presently under review. Her current research interests are deeply attuned to the role of sound in narrative fiction. She is on the executive committee of the Modern Language Association's Sound Forum, co-editor of a special issue on Latin American literary orality that will come out next month with the Revista de Estudios Hispánicos. And of course, she is our esteemed director of the Sound and Humanities Research Cluster. And I know I'm not only speaking for myself when I say this has been a really special place for me, a nurturing space where we have really been able to have conversations about sound and to think about ways of knowing and ways of feeling that we often don't get to think about and feel in the neoliberal university. So today's talk, Sound Unseen, Auscultating Gendered Violence in Mexican Fiction, is drawn from her in-progress book project, Sounds of the Capitalocene, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Extraction and Orality in the Mexican Novel, which traces how narrative soundscapes, or acoustic environments depicted in prose, become a means of critiquing and destabilizing extractive practices in the neoliberal present. So please join me in welcoming Tammy to the stage.
Thank you, Roseanne. That was beautiful. And I'm just so grateful to see all of you here today. This has been so special for me, this sound cluster and the community that we've had. And I'm glad that you're here despite this weather. Many thanks to Sarah, who's been fantastic. The beautiful cookies that we have today are thanks to her knowledge and connections, and to Green College. So thank you for being here, and also on the live stream. The talk that I'm giving, I wanted to, before I get into the kind of official talk itself, I wanted to give you a sample of acousmatic sound, because I think that it's easy to define something, but maybe if we just experience it real quick. So I'll tell you that acousmatic sound, one of the kind of canonical definitions, which we will challenge later in the talk, but sound whose source is not visible to the listener viewer. So this is a definition from film studies. And so thinking about scenes in film where a sound is happening and you don't see its source on the screen, right? So this is related to acousmatic listening, which is listening, it's kind of the inverse of this, listening without visual access to the source, okay? And since I'm a child of the 90s, I'm going to share one of my favorite examples of acousmatic sound. So we'll watch a short clip and yeah, think about this together.
Maybe it's the power trying to come back on.
What is that? Where's the goat?
Okay, so in this scene, we see acousmatic sound from the source is not visible, become visualized sound. And this is something that I'm going to be thinking about in the talk, so it really helps to kind of exemplify. But what are some of the feelings the affects that acousmatic sound is kind of trying to provoke in us? There's not a right answer, but if you're viewing this or you're thinking about the feelings of the characters, what might you name? Dread. Dread is a great one. Yeah. Any others? Yeah. Kind of related fear for me. Yeah. It's meant to create some tension, right? Yeah. Okay. Good. So I also, before kind of diving into the talk, I wanted to mention that a typical use of acousmatic sound we see in horror films, slasher films, right? And as I'll discuss later, this kind of gendered gaze that occurs is very frequently associated with acousmatic sound. Okay, so I'll go ahead and dive in. This first section is called Violence Out of Sight. Oh, I wanted to start my clock, so I won't dive in. I'm going to start my stopwatch. Okay, so Mexican author Cristina Rivera Garza's gut-wrenching 2021 El Invencible Verano de Liliana revisits the 1990 murder of Liliana Rivera Garza, the author's younger sister. Liliana was the victim of feminicide, or, quote, the misogynist killing of women by men, unquote, due to their status as women. A form of violence that has gained notoriety in Mexico and worldwide in the ensuing decades thanks to tireless activism, chiefly by women and families of victims. Liliana's Invincible Summer is the author's attempt to come to terms with the loss of her sister, to honor Liliana, but also to listen to her and to make her sister heard. This compulsion to listen becomes apparent as Rivera Garza's intimate voice recounts, time and again, that Liliana and her loved ones, as well as Mexican society more broadly, lacked a language to identify and name the violence that Liliana was subjected to and that ultimately ended her life. Rivera Garza insists that, quote, neither Liliana nor those of us who loved her had at our disposal a language that allowed us to identify the signs of danger. This blindness, which was not voluntary but social, has contributed to the murder of hundreds of thousands of women in Mexico and around the world, unquote. Rivera Garza develops this motif by pointing at the very recent date, June 14, 2012, on which Mexican jurisprudence codified feminicide in the criminal code, as well as by recognizing her own role, unintentional but undeniable, in failing to perceive the threat that Liliana's boyfriend posed, because like her sister, like the rest of Mexican society, she didn't have the vocabulary to conceive of the danger that Liliana was facing. In this way, the book is a sustained meditation on two interrelated structures, the structure of language and the structure of society, specifically a society in which, in the words of Rivera Garza, quote, The word feminicide didn't exist. The phrase intimate partner terrorism didn't exist, unquote. To confront this reality and begin to imagine a world in which women do not have to fear for their lives and safety, Rivera Garza insists that, quote, we need a language capable of identifying risk factors and moments of extreme danger, unquote. The problem for Rivera Garza is in silence. The structural silence that impedes identifying and naming gendered violence and thus makes opposing or preventing this type of abuse nearly inconceivable. Domestic violence designates abuse that occurs in the home or a domestic relationship and may take many forms, including emotional, sexual, verbal, physical, economic violence. Men comprise the vast majority of abusers, and women are the principal victims of domestic violence and also tend to suffer more severe types of abuse. The United Nations estimates that globally, nearly 1/3 of women have experienced domestic violence or intimate partner abuse, and women of color and those in lower income countries are disproportionately affected by such violence. UN Women's statistics for 2022 showed that, on average, more than 133 women are killed by someone in their own family each day. As is always the case with domestic violence and feminicide, this statistic is delivered with the caveat that the number is necessarily an underestimate, as there are many murdered women whose fates and/or killers are never discovered. Today's talk is about perception, about the capacity to perceive, prevent, and address gender violence and feminicide. Indeed, it is telling that 2 of the key secondary sources consulted here are titled Invisible al ojo clínico, invisible to the clinical eye, and No Visible Bruises. The failure of the eye, or more expansively, the failure of the given to be seen, the given to be known, is a common trope in cases of intimate partner terrorism. When abuse finally comes to light, families and friends are often surprised, questioning how they missed the signs. There are myriad reasons for this, but a key issue is the fact that domestic violence is not always recognizable to society at large, including to victims. Due to a lack of public awareness and education, to euphemisms like crimes of passion, women are often unable to identify behavior as threatening, let alone lethal, until they are deep in a relationship that leaves them isolated and dependent. This reality in which the given to be known, a healthy relationship with a safe partner, does not line up with what occurs behind closed doors, an abusive relationship, is at the heart of the present study. I think through the out-of-sight, out-of-mind nature of domestic violence in my reading of 2 aural novels by Mexican author Guadalupe Nettel, Después del invierno from 2014 and La hija, única from 2020. My reading attunes to aurality. In particular, devisualized and spatialized sonority in the novels as a means of sensing invisible but pervasive domestic violence experienced by women, and I analyze the ways in which the work's soundscapes point to structural misogyny through 2 listening practices: acousmatic listening, listening without visual access to a sound source, and auscultation, spatialized listening. In particular, I show how a feminine devisualized listening counters and undermines the masculine given to be seen, given to be known, in Nettel's sonic novels. This talk is organized around 3 aural gestures that arise across Nettel's novels. First, I examine acousmatic sound and the ways in which this listening practice decenters vision and patriarchal norms to instructive ends. Second, I turn to auscultation, which, beyond physical and metaphorical space, relates tightly to medicine, illness, and normative ableist discourse, a narrative through line in Nettel's narrative corpus. Third, I close by signaling an alternative gesture that releases sound from those enclosed spaces and points to new forms of social structures and relationality that turn away from patriarchal norms. So my analysis begins with 2014's Después del invierno, after the winter, which is told from 2 first-person perspectives: Claudio, a 30-something Cuban expat living in New York City, and Cecilia, a young Mexican studying abroad in Paris. The novel alternates between these 2 strangers' perspectives until 11 chapters in, a mutual acquaintance introduces them in Paris. Each narrator is in a dysfunctional relationship at the time. Cecilia with a chronically ill partner who has disappeared to Italy, and Claudio with a clinically depressed woman 15 years his senior, who he belittles but tolerates given her, quote, resounding silence, unquote, and the fact that her chemically induced docility permits violent sexual encounters that border on rape. After Cecilia and Claudio meet in Paris, a brief romance ensues, but quickly ends on bad terms. The role of sound and listening is central to the dissolution of their relationship, which is the focus of the below reading. Throughout, the novel systematically engages the ear through references to sound and listening, and this sonority is often tied to patriarchal social norms. For instance, on the first page of the novel, Claudio muses, "There are days when I yearn for a family, a discreet and silent wife, a child, preferably a mute one," unquote. He clearly hasn't been around children. Meanwhile, we learn that during her childhood in Oaxaca, Cecilia went through a silent phase in which she, quote, took refuge in a generalized muteness and apathy that alarmed my family, unquote. However, the family doesn't get her treatment because a mute girl is seen as chaste and virtuous. The present analysis focuses on a relatively short section, a 60-page interlude in which the stories of Cecilia and Claudio become briefly intertwined. My reading homes in on a form of listening practiced by Cecilia that lends her a sort of sixth sense, provides vital information about Claudio's character, and helps her avoid an abusive relationship. Sound becomes central to Cecilia's life in Paris when she spends a lonely winter break listening to the radio 24 hours a day in a poorly heated apartment. This radio and the thin walls separating her from the adjoining flat bring her together with Tom, a terminally ill neighbor who, after weeks of Cecilia's continuous radio use, irritably knocks on her door to beg her to shut it off. Quote, "Listen," he said, rapping on the wall with his knuckles to produce a hollow sound. "These walls are like cardboard. My bed is just on the other side of this one. I can hear everything that happens over here," unquote. The powering down of the omnipresent radio allows Cecilia to hone a new mode of listening, attuned to the movement of individuals outside her small apartment. This new form of listening is enabled first by acousmatic sound, right? Sound whose source is not visible to the listener-viewer. And in the case of Cecilia, shutting off her radio companion allows her to hear the acousmatic sounds outside of her apartment, and she begins to hone a sort of devisualized listening, in which she attunes to spaces and individuals that she has seen in the past, but without the current aid of vision. This surreptitious devisualized listening affords new insight. Quote, "I could spend hours listening to these sounds I had never noticed before. I began to listen to the car horns and tires outside, but also to the people who lived in the building. I realized it was possible to decipher their lives through the sounds," unquote. This new listening practice allows Cecilia to intuit details about individuals that they would prefer remain hidden from her. In the case of Tom, due to his labored breathing on the stairwell and plodding footsteps down the hallway, she recognizes his chronic illness months before he confides that he is dying. So what do we make of Cecilia's new listening practice? How might we understand what is afforded to her by honing her acousmatic listening skills? I begin to think this through in dialogue with Roland Barthes and Brian Cain, and you see a shout out to Brian Cain in my talk title. In listening, Barthes distinguishes between hearing, the physiological reception of sound, and listening, which involves attuning to and interpreting distinct noises. He then divides listening into three categories: listening as alert, listening as deciphering of signs, and listening as intersubjective transference. For Barthes, particularly in the case of listening as alert, this practice utilizes acousmatic sound as a means of perceiving the possible presence of a threat before that threat has appeared, has come into view. As he insists, listening as alert is particularly effective in a familiar territory, given that the soundscape is known, which allows the listener to discern new, possibly predatory sounds. He chooses the domestic space of the home to exemplify this process. If an irregular sound emerges in the home, our aural comfort is disturbed, and we perk up our ears to determine if the sound is a threat or benign. Building on Barthes, Brian Cain proposes the term territorial listening for this use of sound as alert in a familiar space. Cain observes that, and I quote, "In successful territorial listening, the acousmatic source is identified ahead of its arrival. The first appearance of the sonic effect affords the territorial listener an advantage, in that the signal permeates the territory in advance of the predator. Listening, lacking a perspective but possessing a perimeter, is the first line of defense for the anxious animal." Unquote. Transposed to the aesthetic realm, acousmatic sound has similar effects on the listener-viewer, or in our case, the reader. As we saw earlier, acousmatic sound is commonly used in horror and suspenseful scenes, and directors and film scholars have found that disembodied sound provokes terror, awe, curiosity, uncertainty, and similar affects. For our purposes, it is telling that a filmic technique used to instill fear in characters and viewers alike is a dominant device in Nettel's fictions on gender violence. In what follows, I show how Cecilia's acousmatic listening becomes her first line of defense, allowing her to be on the alert for the threat underneath Claudio's facade. So armed with her new perceptive capacity, Cecilia begins a long-distance relationship with Claudio. His controlling behavior manifests immediately, and it is yet again through sound that this tendency becomes evident. During an intense email courtship in which an impassioned Claudio writes the more reticent Cecilia multiple times a day, he sends her a CD with extensive instructions for how she should listen to it. Quote, "Close your eyes and listen to Americana. When you get to 2 minutes and 19 seconds, imagine me by your side. Or put on a hymn and listen to as much of it as you can bear from 111 on." After that, I, Cecilia, began receiving CDs with instructions for listening to them as he would suggest. Unquote. From a distance, Claudio attempts what Evan Stark calls coercive control, or ways in which abusers dominate their partners, oppressing them in their personal lives, controlling their time, and depriving them of decisional autonomy, often without harming them physically. Cecilia's response to Claudio's outright coercive control is one of annoyance. Quote, "I must confess that I didn't pay any mind to his instructions. More than rejection or curiosity, such precision bored me." Unquote. She does not yet detect danger in Claudio, which is in line with observations by advocates and experts that many women do not know how to identify early signs of gender abuse. For the reader, though, this behavior is in line with Claudio's treatment of Ruth, who he controls without ever inflicting physical harm by demeaning her, withholding affection, and threatening to end their relationship, not to mention his ex-girlfriend Susanna, who, as he intimates, he drove to suicide through emotional manipulation. Despite her reservations and boredom about Claudio's outright coercive control, Cecilia decides to pursue the relationship and plans 2 trips, one by Claudio to Paris and one by Cecilia to New York. During the long weekend in Paris, Claudio establishes the given to be known, a deceitful facade as a healthy prospective partner, which is not in line with his uncensored behavior. Formally, the alternating first-person narratives juxtapose Claudio's intentions with Cecilia's generous interpretations of each action. As one of many examples, he lies about his arrival time in order to catch Cecilia in bed, but she attributes his earlier arrival to a misunderstanding on her part. In short, she interprets his behavior and speech in line with how he presents himself, assuming good intentions. Thus, a deceived Cecilia sets off to visit Claudio in New York. Fortunately, she has continued to hone her sixth sense, that devisualized listening that attunes to what is not given to be seen. And it is with this capacity that Cecilia begins to understand that Claudio is not as he would have her believe. Her first clue to his controlling behavior involves his daily routine. She notes that, quote, Claudio leapt out of bed at 6 on the dock like an automaton, mechanically repeating the same movements. I could hardly fail to notice his sounds, just as I used to listen to my neighbors. I did not enjoy this one bit. To a certain extent, it alarmed me for what it said about Claudio and his temperament. The sounds he made in the morning betrayed rigidity and intolerance, unquote. Eyes closed and under the sheets, she concludes that these sounds, quote, revealed a different side to Claudio than the one he showed me, unquote. Due to extreme weather, Cecilia is essentially trapped in the apartment while Claudio goes to work in the gym every day. On the evening before her early departure, she prepares a romantic dinner, but Claudio never arrives and he doesn't answer his phone. His silent absence prompts her to go through his belongings, where she finds Susana's letters accusing him of mistreatment and abandonment. After hours of unanswered phone calls, it is once again acousmatic sound, this time angry voice messages from a jealous Ruth on the answering machine, that allows Cecilia to confirm her suspicions about Claudio. Returning to Barths and Kane, the source of the acousmatic sounds that Cecilia perceives is trivial to identify. There is no question that in these scenes, Claudio is the source of the noise she hears from under the covers. However, beyond merely identifying the source, Después del invierno shows Cecilia attuning to other information acousmatically. The rigidness and intensity, the inflexibility and temperament of Claudio's sounds become an index of a potential threat. Predator. Shorn of a gentle smile or other visual, haptic, or even visualized sonic distractors, Cecilia is able to see past Claudio's given to be seen and recognize that he is duplicitous, manipulative, and abusive. Before turning to the second novel of interest to today's talk, I want to signal an important critique in scholarship on acousmatic sound that has arisen in recent years. As a concept largely developed in film theory, a field troubled by the male gaze, acousmatic sound has been wielded to entrench notions of sexual difference and the objectification of women. Indeed, scholars such as Kaja Silverman and Julie Beth Napolin have observed that Michel Chion, in particular, theorizes acousmatic sound in a way that reifies sexual difference by describing the concept in terms of virginity, deflowering, a striptease. So such baggage makes Nettel's narrative deployment of this listening practice all the more potent, as a feminized acousmatic listening becomes a tool for female emancipation, self-care, and vital, in the most literal sense of the word, knowledge accumulation in the novel, supplementing and countering the masculine given to be known. So while devisualized listening protects Cecilia from potential violence in Después del invierno, in Nettel's follow-up novel, published 4 years later with similar aural force, acousmatic sound emerges in a variety of ways. La hija única is told from the perspective of protagonist-narrator Laura, which is an anagram of aural, by the way, I will point out, a doctoral student in literary studies finishing her dissertation in Mexico City. Laura is deliberately childless. She chooses not to become a mother, and she gets her tubes tied while she's in her 30s. Yet the narrative revolves around her relationships with 3 mothers. Alina, a close friend that Laura supports through a difficult pregnancy. Doris, Laura's next-door neighbor who has an abusive young son, Nico. And Laura's own mother, with whom she has a strained but loving relationship. The book is not exceptionally plot-driven, but rather unfolds around the development of Inés, Alina's daughter, and the deepening relationship among Laura, Doris, and Nico. As you can glean from this summary and the book's title, the novel centers on children and offspring. La hija única could be translated to English as the only child or the unique daughter, but was rendered into English as the very richly homophonic stillborn by translator Rosalind Harvey. Important to today's talk, it is through acousmatic sound that reader and protagonist are introduced to the 2 children at the heart of the narrative. The eponymous daughter is Inés, Laura's goddaughter and child of her close friend Alina. Through a series of ultrasounds, Alina, Aurelio, and their community come to love the child growing in Alina's womb. An ultrasound is, of course, a medical technology that introduces high-frequency sound waves into the body. These sound waves then echo off internal organs and tissue to generate electric signals that a computer translates into image form, the sonogram, to produce visuals of internal organs. Popular culture has conditioned us to associate the pregnancy ultrasound with wonder and love and joy, which holds true across the early chapters of La hija única. However, the ultrasound later produces images that worry Alina's doctors, images of Inés's malformed brain. And the now estranged sound images provoke all the negative affects, worry, uncertainty, fear, discussed above in relation to common uses of acousmatic sound in film. I now turn to the other child in the text, 9-year-old Nico, whose role in the novel is germane to today's talk. I'll introduce you to Nico the same way that Laura and the reader meet him, through acousmatic sound. The book begins, quote, "A couple of weeks ago, some new neighbors moved into the apartment next door. It's a woman with a little boy who seems dissatisfied with life, to say the least. I've not seen him yet, but I can tell you this just by listening to him. He comes back from school when the smell of cooking that emerges from his house wafts down the stairs of our building. Everyone knows when he's arrived from the impatient way he presses the buzzer. As soon as he has closed his own front door, the decibel level increases as he starts shouting to complain about what's for lunch. He hurls insults and profanities around, which is somewhat disconcerting in a child of his age. He also slams doors and throws all sorts of things at the walls." 9 years old. So Laura does eventually meet Nico and his mother Doris, who is raising him alone after her abusive husband died in a car accident 2 years before the narrative present. And the neighbors establish a bond that begins to resemble something like a family. However, for a time, Laura's relationship with the pair develops outwardly, acousmatically, before she meets the boy and the mother face to face. For months, she hears his abuse through the apartment wall, each time attempting to drown out the noise with music or audiobooks, and when this fails, she abandons her apartment to go on a walk when she can no longer bear to listen to his insults and physical violence. Laura's reaction shifts, however, when one day, during a particularly destructive assault, Doris reacts not with her typical fearful attempts to calm her son, but by yelling in frustration and leaving the apartment. Later that evening, Laura hears Nico crying through the wall. His tears soon turn to inconsolable wails. Knowing the child is still alone, she decides for the first time not to flee or attempt to drown him out. Instead, quote, "I felt a profound sorrow for this child I had never seen and who perhaps was not as monstrous as I had imagined. I decided to make an effort and listen to him," unquote. This moment of outer care and companionship marks a shift in Laura's behavior. She soon introduces herself to Nico, chatting with him when she sees him around the building. She convinces herself that she can help him, heal him even, and she feels a strong impulse to protect him. Exemplary of this maternal instinct is an exchange that occurs the first time that Laura enters Doris's apartment. Laura sees Nico on the building stoop, and she determines that fresh air and activity will help his tyrannical behavior, so she invites him to a nearby playground. He's excited about the park, but he thinks his mom won't let him go. They part ways, and soon after, Laura hears him screaming at his mother for holding him prisoner in their apartment. Feeling guilty that her invitation has unleashed another tirade, she does something unprecedented for her. She knocks on the door, at which point Nico stops yelling. There's an important instruction there, right, for those of us that don't intervene. She's then invited into the apartment, and she gently confronts Doris. Quote, "I know we haven't met, but I often hear you both from my apartment. Nicolas complains every day that you won't let him out. It must be really hard as a single mom, and I get that you don't have time to go for walks with him. If you allow it, I could take him to the park one day," unquote. When Doris doesn't respond, Laura makes an internal promise, she does this multiple times, to Nico that she will convince his mother and that she can take him to the park. And eventually she does. And then she also prepares his lunches and in essence becomes a surrogate mother as Doris increasingly withdraws into herself. So what I'm interested in these exchanges is that Laura is not motivated by an urge to protect Doris, but rather by a desire to care for Nico, a compulsion to care for the abuser, let's recall, that first emerges through Laura's acousmatic perception of his sobs. So I begin to think through this in conversation with the above-referenced Brian Cain, who asserts that acousmatic listening should be understood as a cultural practice situated in a specific historical moment. Of particular interest is how listeners fill in the visual blanks by using their imagination. For Cain, when listeners hear and interpret a sourceless sound, they produce, quote, "an imaginative projection of a sonic body," unquote. Put simply, they imagine what the source may be. Cain insists that less interesting than how accurate what he calls an imaginative speculation or supplementation is, even more importantly, the imagined source and listener's reaction to it are revelatory of the listener's socio-historical context. Moreover, quote, this sonic body is taken to be transcendent, and acousmatic listening becomes a way to essence, truth, profundity, ineffability, or interiority, unquote. In other words, acousmatic sound has a way of communicating something essential about the particular context in which it is produced and interpreted. So it is my contention that Nettel's narrative fiction positions the listening subject, both the narrator and the reader, in such a way that our imaginative speculation accurately detects domestic violence. And this detection jars loose essential truths about our present. Truths about misogyny and the ongoing threat of violence that shapes women's lived realities, but additionally, essential truths about the way in which we, as a collective, are complicit in the maintenance of patriarchy. Thinking with Chion, I want to suss out what transcendental truths are revealed through Laura's care for Nico, which persists for the remainder of the book. A first uncomfortable truth is revealed by Laura's month-long refusal to address the violence that she perceives through acousmatic sound. Like many outsiders, Laura feels it is not her place to intervene in this domestic issue, so she drowns out the noise with her headphones or flees her home to escape it. I continue to think through these truths with the late Mexican cultural critic Carlos Monsiváis, a steadfast ally of the feminist movement in Mexico. In a bio that accompanied Monsiváis's contributions to the journal Debate Feminista, or Feminist Debate, he described himself in the following way, quote, his misogyny alternates with an impassioned defense of feminism, unquote. This is a self-prepared bio. So when activist scholar Marta Lamas later edited a collection of Monsiváis's feminist writings, she named it Misógino Feminista, feminist misogynist, as a sort of tribute to Monsiváis's self-aware allyship to the feminist struggle. I want to propose that the second transcendental truth revealed by Laura's acousmatic listening is that even feminists can practice misogyny. And Laura, who holds evolved beliefs about bodily autonomy, heteronormative culture, and women's rights more broadly, performs this misogyny when she elevates Nico's wellness above Doris's and participates in the sort of victim blaming that advocates for victims of domestic abuse identify as a chief culprit behind ongoing impunity for abusers. Monsiváis helps us see that even if we recognize and spurn the ways in which patriarchal society devalues and harms women, this does not mean that we have not also internalized its logic. This dovetails with bell Hook's observations in The Indispensable, The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, where Hooks ponders what it means to be feminists, particularly to be a woman feminist, in a world full of men that we love and cherish, but who we also fear, men who love us and men who kill us. Hooks proposes a series of provocations about contemporary feminism, the first of which is that, quote, women have been socialized to be the keepers of grave and serious secrets, especially those that could reveal the everyday strategies of male domination, how male power is enacted and maintained in our private lives, unquote. This critique is distilled in Laura's embrace of Nico in La Hija, Única. Laura's protection of Nico, despite his terrorism of Doris, reveals how we, even feminists, even allies, even survivors, shelter and perversely even nourish abusers and perpetuate misogynist social structures. Importantly, Hooks does not stop there. Indeed, the central proposition of The Will to Change is a critique of the common feminist response to simply give up on men, to judge men irredeemable and lost. Observing that man-hating feminism gives women permission to turn away from male needs, Hooks pushes against this rejection and instead insists that, quote, we claim our power fully only when we can speak the truth that we need men in our lives, that men are in our lives whether we want them to be or not, and that we need men to challenge patriarchy, that we need men to change, unquote. We need men to change. This homophonic phrase contains the seeds of so many truths. We need for men to change. We need men so that we collectively may change. We need changed men to participate in a broader change. In this regard, Hooks makes the uncomfortable, difficult, and brave argument that men, too, are harmed by patriarchy, that men are unable to express their pain, and this silencing often gives way to anger and lashing out, that men want love, want to be able to show love and be loved, And she asserts that by not addressing this reality, we feminists are perpetuating patriarchy. So La Hija Única takes up this position in nuanced ways. A painful example of acousmatic sound from the novel demonstrates this dynamic. Here, Nico admits to Laura that he hears voices, both his own and a man's voice in his head, and that he desperately wants them out, sometimes even slamming his head against the wall to shut them up. This unwelcome acousmatic voice makes manifest that Nico too needs help, that he is both victim and reluctant participant in patriarchal social structures. By casting Nico, a 9-year-old child who witnessed his father brutalizing his mother, Nico, who was not as monstrous as Laura imagined, by casting this smart and sweet boy as the abuser, the novel insists that we recognize gendered violence as cyclical, generational, and structural. So here it is crucial to make clear that Bell Hooks is not advocating for the care of men to supplant or overshadow the care of women. Indeed, Laura's care for Nico is not a panacea, and the abuse of his mother escalates across more than a dozen chapters, with a culminating event that convinces Laura that it is no longer safe for Nico to remain with his mom. The violent attack during which Nico destroys the apartment with a baseball bat that he is swinging toward Doris's head when Laura enters and intervenes finally leads to Nico being sent away to live with an aunt. From this moment on, the novel provides a blueprint of sorts for how to care for the survivors of domestic violence while bearing in mind Hook's admonition that we must also love the abuser. With Nico away from the apartment, Laura shifts her attention to caring for Doris. They first perform a limpieza, a sort of spiritual and symbolic cleaning of Doris's apartment that draws on ancient, feminine, bruja, witchy knowledge. Laura then supports Doris by encouraging her to leave the house, helping her find a therapist, and simply by being a friend. At the same time, the women continue to see Nico via Skype once a week and check in regularly with the aunt on his project. And Laura continues to hope that he'll be able to heal and eventually return. And this shift, this failure at curing Nico, followed by Laura's pivot to prioritizing Doris's well-being, aligns tightly with what Jack Halberstam calls the queer art of failure. Halberstam proposes failure as a healthier alternative to success in a heteronormative capitalist society obsessed with binary formulations. For Halberstam, in certain moments, failure is more rewarding, more realistic, more humane. Failure can be survival. Importantly, or despite, or perhaps even because of the negative affects associated with it, failure can adjust our relationship to what constitutes success and the type of society that has created expectations and structures for success in the first place. By sending Nico away, Laura refuses to continue supporting patriarchal norms, even if that pains her. But this failure ultimately allows her to help Doris in a way that was impossible when she was prioritizing Nico's needs. So I now turn to auscultation in this closing section. In The Will to Change, Bell Hooks speaks of her own experience as a survivor of domestic abuse with recourse to a spatial metaphor. She speaks of her abusive father, quote, imprisoning us behind the walls of his patriarchal terrorism, unquote. As I discussed at the start of the talk, the role of space is crucial to the escalation of gender violence, as abusers isolate victims and take advantage of the privacy of the domestic sphere to abuse with impunity. In the closing section, I think about the spatialized nature of sound across Nettel's 2 novels, and what sound reveals about real and metaphorical structures. Returning to Después del invierno, beyond the supplementary information that acousmatic sound provides, I want to emphasize the spatialized nature of Cecilia's devisualized listening. The sounds she hears draw a sort of map of her apartment building, both in Paris and then Claudio's New York flat. Her listening allows her to locate sounds in space. She notes distance, the resonance of sounds off surfaces and walls that tell her where sounding bodies are located. In short, her listening gives information about space and structures, and this spatialization of sound occurs through the mechanism of auscultation. Auscultation has its origins in the medical field and refers to the act of listening to the sounds of the body for purposes of diagnosis. Immediate auscultation involves pressing one's ear directly against the patient's body, while mediate auscultation is this same medical practice with the aid of an instrument, such as a stethoscope, to amplify sounds. As Peter Szendy emphasizes, auscultation is not merely detecting sounds in space, but more precisely, it is the sound of spacing itself. In other words, doctors attending to the sounds of blood pumping through arteries are not so much concerned with the blood proper, but rather they attend to the corporeal architecture that creates those sounds. They listen for arterial blockages, for weak flow due to thickening walls, for arrhythmias, etc. The flow of the blood through space tells doctors something about the structure through which it travels. Szendy expands auscultation outside the medical field, thinking about its applicability to architecture, but also its more capacious, discursive, and ideological applications. Thinking with Nietzsche, he asserts that auscultation, listening to the sounds of spacing, allows the philosopher to, quote, make quiet things, mute things, speak out, unquote. These mute things for Szendy might be architectural objects like doors, window panes, or ceiling beams, but they might also be metaphorical structures. Auscultation makes sound an otherwise mute object, an apartment wall or kitchen cabinet, but also the discursive and ideological structures that undergird our day-to-day life. Reflecting on the literary mode of the it narrative, or literature that is told from the perspective of an object, like a coin or a watch, Szendy asks himself what type of story a door or a window would tell. As today's talk has shown, Nettel's narrative corpus indicates that the domestic space would often spin tales of violence. Like acousmatic sound, auscultation stems from an inherently paternalistic discipline, that of medicine. Indeed, in the 1819 medical treatise where the term is coin, the French physician-author René Laennec makes clear that a major motivation for immediate auscultation with a stethoscope, for instance, is to avoid contact with the threatening female body. Quote, in the case of females, exclusively of reasons of decorum, immediate auscultation is impracticable over the whole space occupied by the mammae, unquote. Laennec's insistence on physical distance underscores how women's bodies are othered and viewed as sexual objects, even in the non-sexual setting of the examination room. Thus, Nettel's female protagonists appropriate this paternalistic listening practice to revelatory ends. First, given that auscultation constitutes the sounds of spacing itself, we become attuned to literal and figurative structures. Cecilia's devisualized listening detects danger when she hears Claudio's movements in his home, a space of terror for victims of intimate partner abuse. Indeed, the pivotal chapter analyzed above is tellingly titled Rejas, or bars. Meanwhile, Laura perceives ongoing domestic abuse as well as the cyclical nature of gendered violence, which began with Nico's abusive father and persists into the present with Nico. Moreover, the narratives sound out broader social structures that undergird gendered violence in society, thus giving form to the invisible misogyny that normalizes domestic abuse. Finally, in its relationship to medicine, Cecilia's and Laura's auscultating ears constitute a feminine appropriation of a traditionally masculine listening practice that enacts violence on the female gendered body. In this regard, the fact that auscultation is sutured to diagnostic listening situates the topic of domestic abuse within the field of medicine, reorienting intimate partner abuse in the popular imaginary. In this way, Nettel subtly adjusts our perception of gendered violence, shifting it from the domestic, private sphere to a question of public health. So in the closing pages of La Hija, Única, Laura and Doris stumble across a massive street protest in which women, young and old, of all social classes, march with megaphones and signs, spray painting city walls and chanting for the end of gender-based killings, the end of rape, for full bodily autonomy and rights for women. The short chapter first remits to reality, pointing to the rise of feminist protest and social justice efforts that have taken place in Latin America and across the world in recent years. And a week from tomorrow is International Women's Day, or 8M in Mexico. Well, International Women's Day. But the scene also has an instructive function. replacing auscultation and acousmatic sound, whose resonance depends on patriarchal structures, with a communal sounding out that leaves the domestic space. In this way, modes of listening in La Hija Única undertake a gesture similar to Rivera Garza's oral demand. Rather than allowing gendered violence to stay inside, domesticated, listening gives way to sounding, and a very particular form of sounding that carries an ethical, political, and deeply social demand. Ultimately, through a carefully cultivated narrative orality, Nettel's novels insist that gendered violence is often out of sight, but it is discernible to those willing to listen for it. Moreover, sounds in La Hija Única seek to build a new structure, to make common different forms of care and community that turn away from patriarchy and structural misogyny through which domestic violence resonates. So, thank you.